Hello everyone, my name is Kristen Savko, and this is my WebQuest task sample. So for my students, their assignment was to work in groups of 4 and create a screencast presentation of a Vietnam War era poem that used images and words from the poem to help the other students in the class understand the poem that they chose. And then we're going to watch these videos in class on our Vietnam Day and get ready to read just before we start reading the things they carried. So the poem that I chose to do this example on is called Of Late by George Starbuck. So first, students will give a short bio about the author. So the author of this poem is George Starbuck, who is an American poet born June 15th, 1931 in Columbus, Ohio. His poems usually have themes about love, war, and the daily events of the time and the spiritual temper of the time. One critic, Harvey Sharpo, talks about Starbuck as the spokesman for the bright, unhappy young men of the 1960s. He wrote his poems with a very witty sense of humor and filled many of his poems with humorous satire about politics and world events. Starbuck was also a fierce opponent of the Vietnam War. He organized teach-ins and wrote scathing anti-war poems. He died in 1996 from complications with Parkinson's disease. Then students will give an overview of the historical events or historical people in the poem. So the poem centers on Norman Morrison, who was born in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1933. He is known for committing suicide on November 2nd, 1965, at the age of 31. He went down to the street below the Pentagon, right below the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara's office, and burned himself alive. He committed this act to protest the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. He also most likely decided to stage this ritualistic burning alive because a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc burned himself to death in South Vietnam to protest the oppression committed by the South Vietnamese government. So Norman was also a Quaker, which is a Christian religious denomination that is committed to pacifism and nonviolence. They also have a strong social justice movement and work to draw attention to injustice and fight it through nonviolent means. So this was Norman's greatest protest. All right, and now I will do a dramatic reading of the poem Of Late by George Starbuck. Stephen Smith, University of Iowa sophomore, burned what he said was his draft card. And Norman Morrison, Quaker of Baltimore, Maryland, burned what he said was himself. You, Robert McNamara, burned what you said was a concentration of the enemy aggressor. No news medium troubled to put it in quotes. And Norman Morrison, Quaker of Baltimore, Maryland, burned what he said was himself. He said it with simple materials, such as could be found in your kitchen. In your office you were informed. Reporters got cracking, frantically, on the mental disturbance angle. So far, nothing turns up. Norman Morrison, Quaker of Baltimore, Maryland, burned, and while burning, screamed. No tip-off, no release, nothing to quote, to manage to put in quotes. Pity the unaccustomed hesitance of the newspaper editorialist. Pity the press photographers not called. Norman Morrison, Quaker of Baltimore, Maryland, burned and was burned, and said all that there is to say in that language. Twice what is said in yours. It is a strange set, Mr. McNamara, under advice to try the whole of a thought in silence and to oneself. So now each one of the 4 members of the group who has developed this character or persona that they've used to write in their blogs will each be able to have a slide that kind of have a slide and narrate it that tells a little short version of how their character feels about the poem. So the American politician might say something like, Norman Morrison's death was a tragedy, but our involvement in Vietnam did more help than it did harm. We were there to help them win the war against the communists. And then the American soldier might say something like, I was there in Vietnam, and it didn't seem like anyone cared about us. My buddies were dying every day, and they never made the front page of the news. Norman brought attention back to the men dying every day. Next, the anti-war protester might say, Norman was the bravest of all the protesters. He was willing to die to show the government that they were wrong. We rallied around his death and make sure it was not forgotten. We wanted everyone to know that people were really dying in the war. We were really dying for a war that we didn't want to be in. And finally, the Vietnamese citizen might say, I was in Saigon the day the Buddhist monk burned himself alive, and then I heard from the American soldiers that it happened in America too. I just want this war to end. My village has been destroyed, and I just want to go back to my life. And then finally, here's a credit slide, which has information about where I got the poem from and where I got my information and my pictures. And that is it. Thank you so much for watching my sample task project. I hope that you enjoyed it, and thank you so much for watching.